In the stone room, before the fire was lit, there was a child. She was new. She was the first new thing of her kind that the world had yet produced, and in those earliest moments she was simply small and warm in her mother's arms, the weight of her no greater than a handful of gathered wool, her name not yet spoken aloud, her nature not yet fixed into the thing it would eventually become. Rhea held her in the cool of the room and felt the particular stillness of a being who has not yet been required to be anything. Outside, the world that the Titans governed continued at whatever pace it kept. Inside, there was only the stone and the quiet and the first child. The tradition does not describe this room in detail. What Hesiod gives us is sequence and consequence, not sensation. The births recorded in the Theogony as a list of arrivals, each one swallowed. The logic of what Cronus feared, folding each child into darkness almost before they had properly begun. But before the swallowing, there was an arrival, and before the arrival of any other, there was Hestia. She was the firstborn of the 6 children of the Titans Cronus and Rhea, older than Demeter, older than Hera, older than the 3 brothers Hades and Poseidon, and Zeus, who would eventually, between them, divide the world into thirds, and leave nothing unclaimed. She came before all of them. She was the eldest of that generation, the first weight in Rhea's arms, the first breath drawn in the particular air of that particular family. The name she would carry, Hestia, had not yet attached itself to her. It would come, as names do in myth, with a kind of inevitability, as though the name had already existed in the world and was waiting for the right being to grow into it. The Greek word Hestia meant hearth. It meant fireside. It meant the stone ring of a household fire and the warmth that radiated from it into a room. It derived, in the long backward reach of linguistic scholarship, from a Proto-Indo-European root, something close to wes, a syllable that carried within it the meanings of burning and of dwelling, 2 things that the ancient world understood as deeply connected. To burn in one place was to dwell there. To dwell in one place was to be the kind of thing that warmed what was near it. This was what her name would eventually say about her. But at the beginning, in the stone room, in Rhea's arms, she was simply the first. Cronus was not present in the way that might be imagined. The myth does not describe him waiting with any gentleness. What Hesiod describes in the Theogony, across the lines that deal with this sequence of births, is a mechanism, a logic of fear, working itself out through action, each child entering the world and being swallowed almost as part of the same motion. The prophecy that drove the fear was clear. One of his children would one day overthrow him, as he had overthrown his own father, Suarnos. The method Cronus chose to prevent this was, within the logic of divine myth, entirely consistent. He swallowed each child. He kept them inside him, where they could not grow into the thing the prophecy described, where they could not become what they might become if left to the ordinary business of growing up. What the myth holds about this, and this is worth staying with for a moment, is not horror. The tradition does not present the swallowing as an act of cruelty in the way that might register at first hearing. It is something stranger than cruelty. It is a god doing what a god understands to be necessary, operating within the terms of a cosmological negotiation that was already underway before any of the children were born. Cronus had himself overthrown Erenos. He understood from the inside how a son could displace a father. He was attempting to prevent a repetition of his own story, and the method was the method available to him. The children were titans, or would-be gods. What happened to them inside their father was not what would happen to a mortal thing. They waited. They continued. They were not diminished. Hestia, as the firstborn, was the first to be swallowed. She entered that interior space before any of her siblings existed. She was there in the dark, if dark is even the right word for what was inside a Titan, before Demeter arrived, and before Hera, and before the three brothers who came after them. She waited through all of it, through each subsequent birth and swallowing, through the growing population of siblings inside the same strange space, through however long the myth understands to have passed between the beginning of Cronus's reign and its eventual collapse. Of all of them, she was inside the longest. She was the first to enter, and when the reversal finally came, the last to leave. The reversal came, as reversals in this tradition tend to come, through a combination of a mother's grief and a youngest child's cunning. Ares, by the time Zeus was about to be born, had grown unwilling to lose another child to the stone in Cronus's stomach. She wrapped a stone in swaddling cloth and presented it to Cronus in place of the infant. Cronus swallowed the stone. Zeus was taken to Crete and raised in secret, growing into the god who would eventually force his father to disgorge the others. The mechanism of the reversal is, in Hesiod's account, a god induced or compelled to vomit up what he had consumed, and the order of emergence in the tradition ran in reverse of the order of swallowing. The last swallowed came first. The first swallowed came last. Poseidon emerged, then Hades, then Hera and Demeter, and finally, moving through whatever space that reversal opened, Hestia came out last of all, the eldest child, stepping into the world again as though completing a long, slow circle, back to the outside, back to light and air, and the specific texture of stone under the feet, back to the world that Rhea had originally delivered her into before any of this had yet begun. She was the first and the last. She had traveled the full arc of what her generation went through, and she had traveled more of it than any of the others. There is a quality to this that the tradition seems to understand without fully articulating. Hestia is not the sibling who leads. She is not the one whose name appears most often in the myths of contest and transformation that fill the Olympian stories, the stories of war, of pursuit, of desire, redirected into rivers and laurel trees, of gods disguising themselves as animals to accomplish things they would not have been permitted to accomplish as themselves. She is the one who was there first and who waited the longest, and perhaps those two facts shaped something about her, an orientation towards stillness, a preference for the interior, an understanding of waiting that only comes from having waited. The question of what her name meant is one that the ancient world itself was curious about. Plato, in the dialogue called the Cratylus, a philosophical conversation about the nature of language and whether names have any natural relationship to the things they name, pauses over the name Hestia and turns it carefully in his hands. The discussion in the Cratylus is playful and serious at the same time, in the way that Platonic dialogues often are, and what Plato finds inside the word Hestia when he holds it up to the light is something unexpected. He finds a connection to Kousia. The Greek word ousia meant essence. It meant being itself, the fundamental nature of a thing, what makes a thing what it is, rather than something else. Plato argues, with his characteristic combination of genuine inquiry and gentle irony, that the people who named the goddess Hestia were saying something about the nature of things, that hearth and essence were related, that the word for the fire at the center of the house and the word for the fundamental nature of existence were hiding inside each other. Whether Plato meant this as etymology or as philosophy, as a claim about how Greek words actually worked, or as a meditation on what it means to find warmth at the center of things, The Cratylus does not entirely resolve. The dialogue is not meant to resolve it. But the observation sits there in the text, and it is worth sitting with, that the ancient Greek word for hearth, for that specific thing, for the stone ring, and the fire, and the warmth radiating outward from a fixed point into a room, was felt by at least one of the tradition's most careful thinkers to be related to the word for what things most fundamentally are, Hestia, Otia, the fire at the center and the being of things. The connection, once noticed, is difficult to set aside. The linguistic thread that connects Hestia to the Proto-Indo-European root does not stop at the borders of Greece. It runs further into a different language and a different city and a different tradition of worship that would eventually become one of the most elaborated and institutionally complex expressions of what the goddess originally represented. The Latin name Vesta comes from the same root as Hestia, the same wes, the same ancient syllable of burning and dwelling. In Roman religious practice, Vesta was the goddess of the hearth, a virgin goddess, a protector of the home and the civic community, and the focus of a priestly institution, the Vestal Virgins, whose function was to maintain an eternal flame in the city of Rome. The details of Roman Vesta's worship, the particular forms it took, and the civic weight it carried, developed along their own lines over many centuries. But at the root, in the oldest layer of the language, the connection is there. Hestia and Vesta share a name that is older than either of them, as they appear in their respective traditions, a name reaching back to a time before Greek and Latin were separate languages, before the peoples who would speak those languages had yet separated from one another and moved toward their different shores. This is one of the things that the study of ancient languages occasionally produces, a moment where two apparently separate traditions reveal themselves to be standing on the same ground, speaking what turns out to be, at some depth, the same word. The flame in the Roman Forum, and the flame in the Greek Prytaneon, and the flame in the stone-floored room of an ordinary Greek household in the 5th century, before the Common Era, all of them carrying the same root sound forward in time, the same ancient syllable, still moving through different forms of worship, different architectures of stone, different centuries of human life gathered around fire for warmth. Rhea's arms at the beginning held a child who would eventually become all of this. But at the beginning, she was simply the child who was first. The room was quiet. The fire, if there was a fire, was low and steady, burning with the uncomplicated purpose that fire has always had, which is simply to burn, to give warmth to whatever is near it, to mark the place where people have gathered and made a space their own. The name Hestia had not yet been spoken. The nature it described had not yet become the thing it would become across the centuries of worship and practice and philosophical attention that were still entirely in the future. What the myth holds, before all of that, is a single quiet image, the firstborn child, the first of her generation, the one who would enter the longest darkness and wait through all of it and emerge last of all when the circle finally completed itself. She was not yet the goddess of the hearth. She was not yet the one whose name would be spoken first at every offering, whose first portion would be set aside before any meal was eaten, whose fire would burn at the center of every home and every city that the Greek world made. She was simply the eldest. She was simply, in those first moments, the first one who had arrived. The eldest child of a family occupies a particular position in the structure of a family, not simply because of order of birth, but because of what that position means within the logic of the tradition. To be first is to have been there before any of the others, to have known the parents before the others arrived, to change the shape of everything. Hestia was there before Demeter's particular relationship with the earth was established, before Hera's particular relationship with marriage and divine authority took the form it eventually took, before the three brothers divided the cosmos into sky and sea and underworld. She was there before any of the divisions that would come to define the divine family. She was there when Rhea's arms held only her, and the world of the Olympians had not yet begun. There is something worth noticing about what the ancient tradition chose to do with the eldest sibling. In many mythological traditions, the eldest inherits, the eldest leads, the eldest occupies the central position that birth order would seem to promise. What the Greek tradition did with Hestia is different. It gave her a centrality of a completely different kind. Not the centrality of authority or hierarchy, but the centrality of the fire that everything else is built around. The hearth is at the center of the house, and it is there before the house exists in any meaningful sense. The family gathers around it. The city's prytanion, the civic building where the public hearth burned, was the center of civic life in a way that no single political office quite was. Centrality without dominance, the middle of everything, uncontested. But those are the shapes her nature would take later in the temples and the household rituals and the civic institutions of the Greek world. Here, at the beginning, what the myth asks to be held is simpler: a child, first, a swallowing long, an emergence last, a name that carried inside it the oldest root of burning and dwelling, a philosopher in a later century holding the word up to the light and finding, inside the word for hearth, the word for essence, the being of things resting inside the name, for where things gathered to be warm. Hesiod composed the Theogony, the account of the gods' origins, from which the sequence of Cronus and his children is drawn, sometime in the 8th or 7th century, before the Common Era. The text that survives is one of the oldest extended Greek literary compositions. What it contains is not by that point new. It is a shaping of traditions that were already old when Hesiod gave them the form in which they have come down. The stories of Cronus and Rhea, of the prophecy in the stone wrapped in cloth, and the long reversal of the swallowing, these were already part of what the Greek world knew and told. Hesiod arranged them. He gave them sequence and logic. He wrote lines 453 through 467 of what would become one of the founding texts of the classical tradition. And in those lines, he described the birth and swallowing of the children in terms that have moved through translation after translation for nearly 3,000 years. The stone room is the oldest image, Rhea delivering her firstborn into the world, the child warm and new in her arms, the fire not yet lit. This is where the tradition begins, before the Olympians have a name for themselves, before the world has the shape it will eventually take. There is a child who is first. There is a name that means hearth. There is a root word older than the name that carries the meanings of burning and dwelling inside it, like coals banked beneath ash. And there is a very long waiting in the dark before the emergence. The 6 children of Cronus and Rhea, when the reversal finally came, stepped back into the world in the order that reversals produce, last in, first out, the youngest coming before the oldest. Zeus, who had never been swallowed, watching as his siblings were returned one after another. Poseidon, who would become the god of the sea. Hades, who would become the lord of what lay below. Hera, who would become the queen of the Olympians. Demeter, who would become the goddess whose grief would eventually alter the seasons. And then, after all of them, Hestia, the eldest, stepping into the light as the last one out, completing the circle that had begun with her birth, standing again in the world that Rhea had first delivered her into, when there were no other siblings yet, when the Olympian generation was only her. The circle is the image that the tradition perhaps most naturally produces for Hestia. The hearth is round, or described as circular, a ring of stone around a contained fire. The amphidromia, the ritual that Greek families would later perform around the hearth when a new child was born, carrying the infant in a circle around the fire, was a later expression of the same shape, the circle that completes itself, the elder child, who was the first to enter and the last to leave, who described a full arc through the longest darkness of her generation and arrived back where she had begun. She was the last to emerge, and the world she emerged into was already changed by what her siblings had endured with her. They had all been inside, they had all waited, and now they were out, standing in the light that their youngest brother had secured for them, beginning the work of becoming the gods they would eventually be known as, the gods of sea and harvest and divine authority, of wisdom and war and music, of the particular domains that would eventually be divided among the Olympians and held there for as long as the tradition was told. Hestia's domain was already in her name. She did not need to claim it or contest for it or discover it through the kinds of transformative experience that so many of the other Olympian stories describe. The hearth was there, in the root of her name, in the ancient syllable of burning and dwelling, in the philosophical connection that a later thinker would find between her name and the word for essence. She was already, in her name, what she would become. In the centuries that followed the earliest composition of these myths, the long centuries of Greek religious practice and civic life and philosophical attention, the word Hestia became one of the most common words in the Greek language. It meant hearth. It was the word a family used when they spoke of the fire at the center of the house. It was the word that appeared in civic documents when the public flame was discussed. It was a word spoken so often, in so many contexts, that it would have been easy to forget that the word was also a name, that every time someone said Hestia, meaning hearth, they were also quietly saying the name of a goddess. This is the particular quality that Hestia's domain produces, which most other divine domains do not produce in quite the same way. When someone in the ancient Greek world invoked Ares, they named a god. When they invoked Aphrodite, they named a goddess, and also in certain contexts of force, desire, beauty, the pull of one person toward another. But the word for Aphrodite's domain was not simply Aphrodite. The word for Ares's domain was not simply Ares. With Hestia, the name and the thing were the same word. The goddess and the hearth occupied exactly the same linguistic space. To say the word was to say both things at once, inseparably. The flame and the name of the one who governed the flame were the same syllables in the same order. What this means for the way Hestia moved through the Greek world is worth staying with. She was not invoked in the way that a separate divine being is invoked, called upon from a distance, asked to intervene, petitioned to bring a force that is elsewhere into the place where it is needed. She was already there. She was in the word they used for the thing that was already burning in the room. Every household fire was, in the most literal linguistic sense, Hestia, not a representation of her, not a symbol of her presence, but the thing that bore her name in its most everyday and ordinary usage. A low fire burning in a stone room. This is the image the tradition produces when it reaches back to its oldest layers. Not the dramatic fire of Prometheus bringing flame down from Olympus, not the fire of the forge that Hephaestus worked, not the light of Apollo's sun moving across the sky in its daily arc. The fire at the center of the ordinary house, burning at a comfortable height, warming the stone floor and the walls of the room, marking the place where a family had gathered and would gather again, small enough to fit inside a ring of stone, old enough that the word for it predated the Greek language itself, stretching back through Vesta and through the Proto-Indo-European route to a time when the peoples who would eventually speak both Greek and Latin were still one people, living somewhere else, speaking a language that had not yet become two. The Vestal priestesses of Rome, that institution that would eventually maintain a flame in the Roman Forum for centuries, tended by a college of 6 women who served for decades and carried exceptional authority within Roman civic life, were, in the deepest linguistic sense, doing the same thing that any Greek household did when it kept its hearth fire burning. They were maintaining the same root word. They were keeping alive the same ancient syllable of burning and dwelling that had been Hestia's name before there was a goddess to attach it to, or before the goddess and the name had found each other in the form that myth and worship eventually gave them. But that institution, those centuries of Roman Vesta, the detailed texture of what the hearth became in the civic and religious life of Greece and Rome, all of that belongs to the full arc of a much longer story. Here, at the beginning, there is only the stone room. There is only Rhea and the firstborn child, and the quiet before a name is spoken. The fire that would eventually be Hestia's, the fire that would burn at the center of every home and every city that the Greek world built. The fire that the philosophers would sit with and find, somehow the nature of things burning in it. That fire had not yet been lit. There was only the warmth of a new child in the air of a still room. There was only the eldest, the first, the one who would enter the longest dark and emerge last of all, stepping back into the light when the circle completed itself and the world began again. And somewhere in that warmth, in the specific small heat of a new life, in the earliest moment of its existence, was the thing that the name would eventually say, that to burn in one place is to dwell there, that to dwell in one place is to be what warms what comes near, that the word for the fire at the center and the word for the nature of things were in some old and patient layer of the language, always the same word. The stone room, the child, the warmth before the fire is lit, a name reaching back through centuries of speech to a root older than either of its languages. And in a much later room, in a much later century, a philosopher holding the word Hestia up to the light and finding inside it, folded carefully into the syllables of an ordinary word for an ordinary fire, the concept of essence itself, the being of things, resting in the word for where people gathered to be warm. Whatever the tradition was saying when it placed that root inside her name, the flame that the name described has been burning for a very long time, low and steady and amber-colored in the particular way of well-kept fires, in a stone room that has been quiet since before the myths that carry her name had yet been composed. The room is still, the fire is still, and the long waiting, the first child's long patient arc through the dark and back again into the light, has completed itself as quietly as it began, like a circle closing, like a fire that was always going to be there, settling into the slow, unhurried work of being warm. The stone floor is cold at this hour. The fire has been burning since before the family woke, tended through the night by whoever rose earliest, and its low sound, a soft, uneven crackling, like a breath taken and released without urgency, has been the first sound in the room for as long as anyone in the household can remember. The hearth itself is not large, a ring of fitted stones, darkened at their inner faces from years of contact with heat, a shallow bed of ash at the center, and above the ash the fire, low and amber and entirely steady, casting its warmth into the air of the room, the way a held hand casts warmth, not dramatically, not as performance, but as the simple consequence of what it is. This is an ordinary morning in an ancient Greek household. Nothing ceremonial is scheduled. The fire is burning because the fire always burns, and the room is warm because of it, and the family will move through their day anchored at intervals to this center, as they always do, without necessarily thinking of it as anchoring. The hearth at the center of a Greek household was not merely a place where food was cooked, though food was certainly cooked there. It occupied a position in domestic life that had no precise equivalent in a single modern institution. It was simultaneously the kitchen and the altar, and the seat of the household's most fundamental religious observance. And these functions were not separate things that happened to occur at the same location, but aspects of a single continuous reality. The act of preparing a meal at the hearth was understood to be, in some practical and unremarkable way, a religious act. The warmth that kept the room habitable was understood to be, in the same practical and unremarkable way, a form of divine presence. The Homeric hymns make this explicit, but in daily life the understanding did not require the hymns. It was built into the language. The word for hearth in ancient Greek, Hestia, was also the name of the goddess who governed it, and so every household that spoke the language was, simply by naming the place where the fire burned, speaking her name. The hearth was not a monument to the goddess. The hearth was the goddess, or as close to the goddess as anything in daily life could be. The physical construction of a Greek household hearth varied in its details from region to region and across different centuries, but its essential form was consistent: a raised stone platform or ring set near the center of the main room of the house, the oikos, designed to allow the fire to be tended and observed from all sides, its smoke rising toward an opening in the roof above. The placement at the center of the room was not incidental. It meant that the fire was what the room was organized around. The seating, the movement of people through the space, the way the light fell across the walls in the evening, all of this was oriented to the hearth, the way the rooms of a later church would be oriented to its altar. The analogy is imprecise but directional. In both cases, the architecture was built to make something central, because the thing being made central was understood to be genuinely, not metaphorically, at the center of what the building contained. A Greek household hearth, sitting in its ring of darkened stone, was the center of a family's religious life in the most literal architectural sense. The structure of the building said so, in the placement of every wall. At major family events, the hearth's centrality became explicit. When a child was born into a household, the infant was not considered fully incorporated into the family and its religious life until the amphidromia, a ritual in which the newborn was carried in a slow circular procession around the hearthstone, formally presented to the fire, introduced to the goddess in the most direct physical way available by being brought near and held in the warmth of her presence. The ritual confirmed the child's belonging. It made the birth socially and religiously real in a way that the biological fact of the birth alone did not. Marriage was similarly marked at the hearth. A new bride entering the household would be welcomed in a ceremony that involved the hearth fire. The new domestic unit she was joining made manifest in the flame that she was now, in some sense, joining her life to. Travelers departing a household made their farewell in the presence of the fire. Guests arriving were welcomed into a household that was understood to be under the goddess's governance, which conferred on them a degree of protection, however temporary, however contingent, simply by virtue of their having crossed the threshold into a space the fire made sacred. The form of that protection had specific weight in ancient Greek religion. A person who fled to a household hearth and sat there as a suppliant. The Greek word was hikates, was understood to be placing themselves under Hestia's direct protection, and to remove such a person by force, or to harm them while they sat at the hearth, was understood as an act of impiety, directed not against the suppliant personally, but against the goddess, whose presence made the hearth what it was. This was not a legal principle. Exactly. Greek religious practice and Greek law were adjacent, but not identical systems, but it carried genuine social and religious force. The suppliant at the hearth was not simply a guest. They were someone the fire itself had received, and the fire's reception was the goddess's reception, and the goddess did not invite mistreatment of those she had taken in. The mechanism was elegant in its simplicity. The protection was not asserted by the supplicant or negotiated with the household. It was simply present, as the fire was present, and its violation was as visible and legible as the act of breaking any other obvious sacred boundary. The household hearth, then, was not a private thing in the sense of something sealed off from larger social and religious structures. It was a node in a network that extended outward from the family, through the neighborhood, and the city, and into the formal civic institutions of the polis itself. And the most visible expression of that network, the point where the domestic hearth's logic was scaled up to the dimensions of an entire city, was the Prytaneon. Every significant Greek city-state maintained a Prytaneon, a public building, whose defining feature was a hearth, perpetually burning, dedicated to Hestia, and understood to be the civic counterpart of the household fire that burned in every home. The Prytaneon was not a temple in the conventional sense. It did not house a cult statue. It did not host dramatic religious festivals in the way that a temple of Apollo or Athena might. Its sacred object was the flame itself, and the flame, tended continuously without interruption, was the city's equivalent of the fire that every household maintained. The city, like the family, organized around a center, the center marked by the fire bearing the goddess's name. At the Prytaneon, the city's highest officials, its magistrates, its executive council, in whatever form the particular city's constitution gave it, conducted a portion of their formal duties. The building served as the official dining hall for those in civic office, and the meals held there were not simply practical arrangements for feeding busy officials. Eating in the presence of the sacred hearth made the meal a ritual act, continuous with the religious understanding that governed the domestic hearth in every home. The city's leaders ate as the family ate, with the fire at the center, with Hestia implicitly present, with the ordinary and the sacred folded together into a single unremarkable act. The Prytaneon was also where the city's formal hospitality was extended to distinguished guests, foreign dignitaries, victorious athletes, those who had performed exceptional services to the city, and were honored with the privilege of eating there at public expense. To be invited to dine at the Prytaneon was one of the most significant honors a Greek city could bestow, and the honor was inseparable from the sacred character of the space. The fire made the invitation more than a meal. Archaeological evidence for the Prytaneon as an institution has been recovered at several major sites across the Greek world. At Athens, the Prytaneon has been located through a combination of literary references and excavation in the northeastern part of the ancient city, near the base of the Acropolis. At Olympia, the sacred site that housed the most prestigious athletic games in the ancient world, a Prytaneon with its hearth has been identified, the flame there burning continuously, not just through the duration of the games, but as a permanent feature of the sanctuary's religious life. At Delphi, the site of Apollo's most important oracle, one of the most significant religious locations in the entire Greek world, a Prytaneon maintained Hestia's fire alongside the sanctuary's other sacred institutions. At Ephesus, On the coast of Asia Minor, the pattern was the same. Wherever a significant Greek civic community organized itself, the Prytaneon and its hearth were part of what the community built. The institution was not local or particular to one city's religious tradition. It was Greek, as thoroughly as the language was Greek, as common as the agora and the gymnasium and the assembly where citizens met to deliberate. Every city had a center. The center held a fire. The fire was Hestia's. The most extraordinary expression of the hearth's civic logic was the practice of colonial fire. When a Greek community sent out settlers to found a new colony, and throughout the archaic and classical periods, Greek colonies were established across an enormous geographic range, from the shores of the Black Sea to the coasts of southern France and Spain and North Africa. The colonists did not simply carry their language and their customs and their architectural forms to the new location. They carried fire. Before a colonial expedition departed, the settlers would take fire from the Prytaneon of their mother city, the hearth that held the city's sacred flame, and carry it with them on the ship, kept burning in a clay vessel or a lamp, protected during the crossing as carefully as any other essential supply. On arrival at the new settlement site, this fire would be used to kindle the hearth of the new city's Prytaneon, and the new Prytaneon's flame would then carry within it, in the most literal and physical sense possible, the presence of the mother city's fire. The colony was linked to its point of origin, not through records or contracts or symbolic gestures, but through the actual physical continuity of the same flame, or as continuous as fire can be, carried across the hours and the open water in a vessel small enough to hold in two hands. The logic of this practice was clear and beautiful within its own terms. A city was not simply a collection of people or buildings or laws. A city was a living community under divine governance, and the hearth fire was the most tangible expression of that governance. To take the fire to a new location was to extend the divine presence, to bring Hestia's attention, so to speak, to the new community before it had yet built its walls, or chosen its magistrates, or established its own customs. The fire arrived first. The city grew around it, and the city that grew around that fire was genuinely religiously connected to the city from which the fire had come, because the fire was the same fire, carried across the water in a clay pot on the deck of a ship, kept alive through the crossing by whoever had been entrusted to tend it. The practice made lineage into something you could see and measure. The flame that burned in a colonial Prytaneon in Sicily or on the coast of Anatolia was the flame that had burned in the mother city's hearth before the colonists ever departed, and its continued burning was the continued presence of that connection. The Prytaneon at Olympia is worth dwelling with for a moment. Pausanias, writing his description of Greece in the 2nd century of the Common Era, visited the site and observed the hearth there, still burning, still tended, still the same institution it had been for centuries before his visit. The flame he described was not a reconstruction or a revival. It was the same continuous practice, carried forward by the same institution in the same place. Pausanias was a careful observer and not given to exaggeration, and his account of the Olympian Prytaneon treats the sacred hearth with the same measured, interested attention he gives to the statues and the temples and the other monuments of the sanctuary. He was not describing something he found remarkable because it was unexpected. He was describing something that was simply there, as it had always been, as part of what Olympia was. The flame in the Prytaneon burned through the days of the games, through the quiet months between them, through the years when the games were not held, and the sanctuary was less crowded, through all of it, without interruption, without ceremony beyond the ordinary care of those who tended it. It burned because that was what it did. A fire, tended, burns. The hearth fire's relationship to marriage in Greek custom opened another dimension of the institution's meaning. When a woman married and left her father's household to join her husband's, the transition was not simply a social or legal event, it was a religious one, marked explicitly at the hearth. The bride's family would take a lit brand from their household hearth and carry it in the wedding procession to the new home, where it would be used to kindle fire at the hearth of the household the bride was now entering. The moment of kindling was the moment of joining. Two household fires becoming one was the domestic religious version of what the marriage contract enacted in civic and familial terms. The hearth of the new household, lit from the fire of the bride's father's home, carried within it the lineage and the presence of her family's religious life, now extended into a new space, a new generation, a new set of rooms organized around a new center. The corresponding ritual logic applied when a family line ended. If a household's direct lineage failed, if there were no heirs to tend the fire, to maintain the household's continuity, to carry the family's religious obligations forward into the next generation, then the hearth fire was extinguished. The extinction was the concrete ritual acknowledgement that the family was over. The fire going out was not simply a practical consequence of no one being present to tend it. It was the symbol, the performed statement that the line had ended. As the fire was what a living household was organized around, its extinction was what the end of a household looked like. The two things, the fire and the family's continuity, were so thoroughly identified with each other that one served as the embodiment of the other in both directions. And the fire burning meant the family continuing, the fire extinguished meant the family gone. Between those two states, there was no ambiguity and no middle position. All of this, the domestic hearth, the prytanion, the colonial fire, the protection of suppliants, the marriage kindling, the extinction at the end of a family's line, was gathered under Hestia's governance without her needing to perform any specific divine action to govern it. This is one of the genuinely unusual features of her position in Greek religion. Most Olympians were understood to involve themselves in human affairs through intervention, Apollo sending plague or withdrawing it, Poseidon stirring the sea or calming it, Athena advising the hero in his difficulty. Hestia's presence in the hearth was not of that kind. She did not intervene. She was simply present, constantly, in the thing that was named for her, and her presence was what made the hearth what it was. The protection of the supplicant was not Hestia reaching down from Olympus to shield a particular person. It was the nature of the hearth itself, understood as her continuous presence, that provided the protection. Her governance was inseparable from what she governed, the way the warmth of a fire is inseparable from the fire. She did not produce warmth as a separate act. She was the warmth in the sense that the hearth was her, and the hearth produced the warmth, and the logic flowed through without a gap. This made her simultaneously the most domestically present of the Olympians, and the most formally absent from the myths that place the gods in dramatic relation to one another. She does not appear in the Trojan War. She does not pursue lovers, or transform rivals, or claim contested territories. She does not take sides in the quarrels that animate so much of what the tradition records. The hearth burned through all of it, through the wars and the wanderings and the punishments and the reconciliations, and Hestia was there in the burning, which meant she was present everywhere at once, in every household, on every side of every conflict, tending all of them with the same even warmth, taking no position except the position of being at the center. The prytania of Greek cities burned through the night, while the city's magistrates completed their civic business in the spaces around the hearth. The flame's reflection moved slowly across stone walls that had held the fire for generations. The meals eaten in those rooms were ordinary meals, bread and wine and whatever else the city's public hospitality provided, and they were also, by virtue of the fire in the center of the room, something that existed on the boundary between the everyday and the sacred, the boundary that Hestia inhabited as a permanent address. The magistrates eating in the Prytanean were eating in the goddess's house. This was not a metaphor. The flame in the room was her name made visible, her presence made material, and the meal shared in its light was shared in her company. The warmth radiating from a stone hearth at the center of a room has a particular quality at this hour, not the dramatic warmth of midday sun or an open fire leaping high, but the steady, low, even warmth of something that has been going a long time and has settled into its rhythm. A family moving through an ancient Greek household on an ordinary evening would have felt that warmth as a background condition. The way the sound of a river running near a house becomes part of what the house feels like. The fire's constancy was its character. It did not surge. It did not falter. It burned at whatever rate the wood and the tending allowed, and its job was not to impress, but to continue, to be there in the morning as it had been there the night before, reliable and central and warm. The practice of tending the civic hearth fire, the Prytanean's sacred flame, was managed carefully enough that its continuity could be maintained across years and decades, and in the case of certain sites, centuries. The flame was not allowed to go out, and if for some reason it did go out, the relighting was not casual. Fire taken from the sun, using focused sunlight to kindle a new flame, was the preferred method of purification, a way of beginning again from the most original source available, rather than simply borrowing fire from a neighboring hearth. The logic of the preference was the same as the logic of colonial fire. Continuity mattered. The source of the flame mattered. The genealogy of the fire was part of what the fire was. A flame kindled from sunlight was a flame that had not passed through the intermediary of any other human institution. It came directly from above. It was, in the only sense that ancient Greek religious thought had a vocabulary for, new and uncontaminated. This care for the fire's genealogy, the attention to where a flame came from, what it connected to, what its burning signified about the community maintaining it, was not a specialized priestly concern practiced only in formal sanctuaries. It was present in the logic of every household hearth, in the attention paid to keeping the domestic fire burning, in the care with which fire was borrowed or shared between neighbors, in the understanding that a fire carried from one household to kindle another was carrying something of the first household's life into the second. The scale changed, household to Prytanean to colonial expedition, but the underlying logic was consistent across all of it. Fire was continuous. Its continuity was meaningful. What a flame had been lit from was part of what the flame was. In the morning, before the family gathered in the room, the hearth would be tended by whoever rose first, the ash raked, the coals checked, new wood set if needed, the fire encouraged back into its daytime presence from the lower, slower burning of the overnight hours. This was not a ritual performance. It was ordinary maintenance, the same kind of careful attention that kept a household's water supply clean or its roof sound. And yet it was also a form of religious practice, in the same unremarkable way that all the other interactions with the hearth were forms of religious practice, not because a specific ceremony was being performed, but because the thing being tended was a sacred thing, and tending it was therefore always, in some quiet and continuous way, an act of care directed toward what the household held most central. The fire, tended through the night, was ready by morning. The city's fire, tended through the year, was ready for the colony's ship. The colony's fire, carried across the water in a clay vessel, was ready for the new Prytanean's hearth. And all of it, the household fire, and the civic fire, and the fire carried across open water on the deck of a ship heading toward an unbuilt city, was the same institution, the same understanding of what a center was, what a community organized itself around, what made a collection of people in a place into something with a religious identity, and not merely a geographic location. Hestia was present in all of it, not as a figure who appeared or acted, but as the thing the fire was named for, which was also the thing the fire was. The word and the phenomenon were not separate. Saying the word for hearth was saying her name. Tending the fire was tending her presence. The warmth in the room was hers, in the only sense that mattered within the tradition that held these things to be true. The clay vessel carrying fire across open water between one shore and another is an image worth staying with. It was not large, a pot designed to hold coals, sealed enough to protect the fire from wind and spray, carried by a person who had been given the specific responsibility of keeping it alive during the crossing. The ship around it might carry settlers with their tools and their seeds and their household goods, the accumulated material basis of a community attempting to begin itself in a new place. Among all of that, the clay pot with the fire was doing something different from everything else aboard. It was not providing for a future need. It was maintaining a present reality, the continuous existence of a flame that had been burning before the colonists left and would continue burning after they arrived, the thread of fire connecting the new city to the old one before the new city had yet been built. The Mediterranean is not a calm sea. Crossings between the Greek mainland and the sites of colonial foundations in Sicily, or on the coast of southern France, or along the shores of the Black Sea, involved real distances and real weather, and a clay vessel carried on the deck of an ancient ship was not protected by the controlled environments available to modern transport. The person tending the fire during the crossing was tending it under actual conditions, wind and salt air, and the motion of the ship, and the care required to keep it alive under those conditions was practical and specific and not easily romanticized. The fire was preserved through skill and attention. Its arrival at the new shore was a genuine achievement, not a symbolic one. And when it was set down on the stone of the new Prytanean's hearth, and the new city's fire was kindled from it, the flame that had survived the crossing was the fire that made the new hearth what it was. A city's identity held inside a flame, small enough to cup in two hands. This is what the practice amounted to, and the practice did not strike those who carried it out as strange or extravagant. It was simply how cities were extended, how communities replicated their essential character in a new place, how the goddess's presence was established in a location where she had not yet been. The fire arrived before the walls were built. It would still be burning when the walls were very old. And somewhere in the mother city, a flame was still burning from whatever source it had been kindled from, connected to the colonial fire by the same thread of continuity that connected every hearth in the Greek world to every other, the same goddess, the same name, the same warm and steady light. The hearth fire burned the way it always burned, steadily, without effort, the way a thing burns when it has been burning long enough that burning is simply what it does. In the oldest accounts of the Greek tradition, there were three goddesses who sat entirely beyond the reach of a particular kind of power. That power belonged to Aphrodite, the force of desire, the pull of longing, the wanting that moved gods and mortals alike toward one another across any distance the world might set between them. Aphrodite's influence, the tradition held, was not a matter of preference or invitation. It was a condition of existence that moved through the divine assembly, the way light moves through a room, filling it, touching everything, leaving no corner undisturbed. And yet the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite names three goddesses who remained outside that condition entirely. Athena, whose gray eyes looked always outward at the civic world; Artemis, whose attention was turned toward the edge of the forest and the cold of the high mountain; and Hestia, sitting quietly beside the fire, the same as she had always been, the flame beside her burning the way flames burn when they have no particular reason to change. The hymn does not describe Hestia resisting anything. That is the detail worth sitting with for a moment, because resistance implies a force pressing inward that must be held back, a wanting that must be denied, an effort maintained against something. What the hymn describes instead is a different condition, an immunity that is not the result of effort, but of nature, a stillness that does not oppose the world of desire so much as exist in a different register from it entirely. Aphrodite moved through the assembly of gods with the ease of someone moving through a room full of people she already knew, and Hestia sat beside the fire, and the fire burned, and nothing in that image required explanation or apology, because nothing in it was in tension with anything else. The three immune goddesses, Athena, Artemis, and Hestia, were each autonomous by entirely different means, each shaped by a completely different kind of life, each occupying her stillness from a different direction. But of the three, it is Hestia's stillness that is the hardest to describe, because it is the most interior, the most completely settled into itself, the least complicated by the outer world. Athena's immunity is legible in a particular way. She stood armored, associated with war, and with the precise organized intelligence that made cities possible. Her virginity had a martial quality, the turned attention of someone whose mind was always directed outward at the problem of how the civic world held together, at the strategy of conflict, at the wisdom that served purposes beyond itself. There was an energy in Athena that expressed itself perpetually, that found form in action and in thought and in the institutions she protected. Her stillness, if it can be called that, was the stillness of a bow at full draw, force gathered, directed, about to be released into the world. And Artemis, her immunity was the immunity of the threshold. She belonged to the edge of things, to the moon above the tree line, to the hunt moving through forests, where the city's authority did not reach. Her distance from the world of desire was the distance of someone who had gone far enough into the wild that the concerns of the domestic life had simply dropped away behind her. She was not unmoved. She was elsewhere. Her virginity was a form of sovereignty over territory that could not be shared, the high slopes, the uncultivated places, the wild things that knew her name. And then there is Hestia, sitting beside the fire, the goddess whose immunity was not the directed force of Athena, and not the wilderness distance of Artemis, but something quieter than either, a self-containment that required nothing from the outer world in order to be complete. The tradition consistently positions Hestia as the most passive of the three virgin goddesses, and the word passive is important to stay with, because in a tradition that valued action and eloquence and the dramatic expression of divine will, the most passive figure in the assembly is not the least powerful. She is simply the one whose power operates by different means. The fire does not reach out across the room. It burns where it is, and the room organizes itself around it. Whatever it illuminates It illuminates by staying where it is and continuing to be warm. This is the context in which the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite introduces what happened next. Two suitors came, not minor figures, not gods at the edges of the divine assembly, but two of the most significant presences in the Olympian tradition, Apollo and Poseidon, each arriving with the serious intention of making Hestia his wife. Apollo was the god of light and prophecy and music, the most articulate speaker in the divine family, the one whose voice shaped oracles and whose form was associated with clarity and order and the particularly Greek idea that beauty and precision were the same quality. Poseidon was the god of the sea, the oldest, vastest, most ungovernable element in the ancient world, whose moods produced storms and whose favor made harbors possible. Between them, they represented something close to the full range of what the divine male could embody. The hymn does not record what either of them said when they made their case. What the hymn records is that they made it earnestly, that the desire was genuine, and that Hestia declined. The image is worth holding carefully. Apollo in the halls of Olympus, the god of light, the god whose speech was associated with truth, making his argument for Hestia's hand with the eloquence that was his nature. The tradition describes him as beautiful, as someone whose presence in any conversation altered the quality of what could be said, and Hestia listening, sitting beside the fire doing what fires do, not noticing the argument, not being compelled by the beauty of the speaker, simply burning at the temperature fire burns at, when it has been well laid and correctly tended. The hymn does not record Hestia's reply, and that silence is itself a kind of reply. What she said was, no. What the no contained, the tradition does not elaborate on, but the absence of elaboration does not suggest that the no was casual. It suggests that it was complete, and then Poseidon made the same request and received the same answer. The god of the entire ocean, a domain that covered more of the world than any other, that extended to depths nothing living could reach, that had been shaping the edges of continents since before the gods had names, asked the goddess whose domain was a fire, small enough to fit inside a stone ring on a household floor, to become his wife. The scale of that contrast does not seem to have entered into Hestia's consideration one way or another, and that is perhaps the most precise description of her nature that the myth offers. She was not unmoved by power. She was not aware of power as a reason to change her answer. Whatever she was entirely it, and entirely it was enough. What happened after both suitors had been refused is the detail the tradition preserves with particular care, because it is here that Hestia's nature finds its most formal expression. She went to Zeus. The tradition records that she touched his head, a gesture that carried the weight of the most solemn kind of divine commitment, a physical act of oath-taking that made the words spoken alongside it binding in a way that words alone could not be. And swearing by Zeus's head, she asked for something that was also a renunciation. She asked to remain a virgin forever. She asked that the condition she was already in be made permanent and sealed by the authority of the king of the gods, so that what was her nature became also her oath, and what was her choice became also her protection. The gesture itself is worth dwelling on. The eldest sister touching the head of the youngest brother. Hestia was the firstborn of the 6 children of Cronus, and Rhea the first into the world, in one sense, and in another sense the last, having spent the longest time inside their father before being released. Zeus was the youngest. He had grown up beyond their father's reach, in Crete, fed on honey and goat's milk, and it was he who had eventually returned to force the disgorging of his siblings and the overthrow of Cronus's rule. And so the gesture carries inside it something of the full arc of their shared story. The eldest and the youngest of the same generation, the goddess who had been swallowed first, and the god who had never been swallowed at all, arriving at this moment of formal commitment. Hestia reaching out, Zeus receiving the touch of her hand, the oath taking hold. Zeus did not simply accept the oath. He honored it and ratified it and gave something in return. What he gave her, what the tradition records as the formal acknowledgement of her choice, was the first portion. At every household sacrifice, at every domestic offering, at every moment when a Greek family placed food or drink at the hearth before the meal began, that first portion went to Hestia, not to Zeus, who commanded the sky, not to Poseidon, who held the sea, not to Apollo, who spoke the future, to the goddess who sat beside the fire and had asked only to remain exactly what she already was. The first portion, in every house, at every hearth, in every meal, from that moment forward. The custom settled into Greek domestic life with the quiet permanence of something that becomes habitual. Quickly, because it answers some need the household did not know it had, the need to begin with an acknowledgement, to name the center before gathering around it, to let the fire receive its portion before anyone else eats. There is a quality in this arrangement that is worth noticing. The reward for Hestia's renunciation was not a throne or a domain or a title or a power over some portion of the world. The reward was a ritual of domestic attention, repeated in every house, every day, in the ordinary rhythm of family life. It was not exceptional. It did not require a festival or a special occasion or a particular priest. It required only that someone in the household, on an ordinary evening, place the first portion at the hearth and understand that the gesture had a name. This is how Hestia's worship worked, not through the public, elaborate ceremony that distinguished the worship of other Olympians, but through the quiet repetition of small daily acknowledgement that the fire at the center of the house was not a neutral physical fact, but a presence with a name and a nature and a prior claim on whatever warmth the household generated. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite names all three of the virgin goddesses in a single passage, and the manner in which it does so allows the listener to hold all three in the same moment and feel their differences clearly. Athena, who delights in wars and the work of Hephaestus, who is interested in the shaped world, in the things that intelligence produces when it applies itself to material. Artemis, who loves the bow and the hunt and the cry of the chase across the mountain, who is interested in motion, in the threshold, in the world that exists beyond the edges of the cultivated. And Hestia, who did not choose Aphrodite's gifts. The hymn's phrasing is precise in its simplicity. It does not say Hestia resisted. It does not say she refused. It says she did not choose, as though desire were a path that some people take, and Hestia simply did not take, not because the path was closed to her, but because she was already where she was going. The difference between Hestia's virginity and the virginity of her two counterparts is a difference of character rather than of degree. Athena's autonomy was directed outward. She was deeply involved in the world, patron of the most important city in Greece, present at battles, guiding heroes through the difficulties of mortal life, interested in outcomes and solutions, and the particular beauty of things that are well made. Her stillness was a stillness with an engagement. Artemis's autonomy was defined by its boundary with the world. She was the goddess of the threshold, of the edge of the cultivated land, of the moment when the human and the wild made contact. Her stillness was a stillness at the edge of motion. Hestia's autonomy was interior in a way that the other two were not. She did not need the world to come to her, and she did not need to go to it. The fire was where it was. The warmth spread from it in the way warmth spreads, not by moving itself, but by altering the quality of the air around it. And what the household felt, gathering in the room where the hearth burned, was warmth, not the act of warming, not the intention to warm, just the warmth, because that was what fire was. The Homeric hymn to Aphrodite is the longer and more famous of the two Greek hymns associated with Hestia. The second is almost nothing at all. The shorter hymn, the 29th in the Homeric collection, consists in its standard Greek text of 13 lines. 13 lines that stand as the whole of a hymn to one of the oldest divine figures in the Greek tradition. The brevity is one of those details that asks to be looked at more than once, because the length of a text in this tradition was not incidental. The major hymns to Apollo run to hundreds of lines. The hymn to Hermes extends to 580, and the hymn to Hestia ends in its entirety at 13 lines, short enough to be spoken in a single slow breath, short enough to fit in the margin of another text, short enough to seem at first glance like an incompleteness, as though whatever was meant to follow simply never arrived. But the content of those 13 lines is not incomplete. The hymn praises Hestia as the keeper of the sacred dwelling of Apollo at Delphi, the great oracular sanctuary of the ancient world, the place where the future could be asked about, the center of the Greek religious world in a more formal and theatrical sense than Hestia usually occupied. It is an unusual detail. Delphi belonged to Apollo in the cultural imagination. It was the place of his voice, his priestesses, his famous ambiguity. And the hymn to Hestia says that within that place of Apollo's greatest authority, Hestia was the keeper of the house itself. Whatever Delphi said, whatever future it revealed, whatever oracular fire burned at its center, Hestia was the presence that tended the building those things happened in. And then the hymn turns, in its final few lines, to a request that Hestia enter the house alongside Hermes. With goodwill, and with beauty, and with prosperity, the two deities of the threshold and the hearth arriving together, the god of boundaries and crossings, and the goddess of the fire that waits on the other side of the door. The pairing is one of those small mythological arrangements that looks casual until it becomes illuminating. Hermes was the god of movement, of travel, of messages carried between distant points, of the boundary between the living world and the dead one, of all the transitions that required a divine escort, because transitions were dangerous in a tradition that held boundaries to be places of power and risk. He moved constantly. He was the figure who could not stay anywhere, whose nature was the nature of passage rather than of dwelling. And Hestia was the figure who could not leave, whose nature was the nature of the fixed point, the center, the thing that everything else moved around. In the short hymn's closing image, they arrive together, the most mobile of the Olympians and the most still, crossing the threshold of the house side by side, Hermes carrying whatever he carries, and Hestia becoming, as she always becomes, the fire that was already there. The theological content of Hestia's vow is worth considering carefully, and the tradition itself offers material for that consideration. In Greek religious thought, the category of the virgin goddess was not primarily about the renunciation of sexuality in a moral sense. The three virgin goddesses, Hestia, Athena, and Artemis, were not defined by what they refused as much as by what their autonomy made possible. A goddess who belonged to no husband, belonged to no household, answered to no domestic authority, occupied no subordinate position in the divine family structure, that would diminish her sovereignty over her own domain. The vow of virginity, in this context, was less a renunciation than a declaration of self-completeness, a formal statement that the goddess's nature did not require completion from outside itself, that whatever she was it entirely, that the fire burning at her center did not need another fire to be whole. For Athena, this self-completeness expressed itself as civic power. Her authority over the city of Athens was an authority that did not answer to any domestic loyalty, any marital obligation, any claim that another deity could place on her attention by virtue of shared household. For Artemis, it expressed itself as wild sovereignty. Her domain was the ungovernable wilderness, and the condition of governing it was that she could not be governed by the domestic arrangements that organized the human world below. For Hestia, self-completeness was the most literal form of all three. She was the hearth itself, the center of the household, and a goddess who simultaneously governed the hearth and was contained by a domestic obligation to a husband would have faced a structural impossibility that the tradition, with its usual precision, simply did not allow. The center of the house could not also be a dependent within it. She could tend the fire, she could not be owned by any single hearth. There is something in the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite that deserves attention beyond the simple naming of the three exempt goddesses, and that something is the framing of Aphrodite's power itself. The hymn describes Aphrodite's ability to move gods and mortals toward one another as a form of governance. She governs the cries of beasts, the movements of fish in the sea, the flights of birds, the desires of human beings and Olympians alike. The world the hymn describes is a world organized by wanting, and Aphrodite is the force that makes that wanting coherent, that gives it direction and object, and the particular ache that is its signature. Three goddesses, the hymn says, are exempt, and the word exempt carries a weight that the framing around it helps clarify. They are not less than the world Aphrodite governs. They are not diminished by their position outside it. They are simply in a different relationship to the organizing principle of wanting, not wanting less, exactly, but wanting in a direction that Aphrodite's power does not address. Hestia wanting to remain Hestia, wanting the oath, wanting the permanence of the condition she was already in, going to Zeus to make that want formal and binding, is itself a kind of desire. It is just a desire that does not aim at another person. It aims at itself, at the continuation of what it already is, at the quiet and absolute ambition of a fire that wants to keep burning. The image of Hestia touching Zeus's head to swear her oath belongs to a category of mythological gesture that the tradition preserves carefully, because gesture in this tradition did real theological work. The gods did not simply speak their commitments. They embodied them, enacted them, made them physical, so that the physical world became the record of the divine will. When Hestia reached out and placed her hand on Zeus's head, she was not performing a symbolic act. She was completing a circuit, the eldest of the divine generation touching the youngest, the firstborn ratifying her nature through the king of what had been made after her, the fire at the center of the house, acknowledged by the highest authority in the divine order. And Zeus, receiving her hand, made her choice permanent in the way that only the king of the gods could make a choice permanent, not by granting her something she did not already have, but by confirming, formally and without reservation, that what she was forever. The full weight of that confirmation is easy to move past, and worth not moving past. Zeus had been offered Hestia in marriage by two of the most powerful figures in his own assembly. He had been the recipient of appeals from Apollo and Poseidon, both two gods whose support and goodwill mattered to the maintenance of the divine order that Zeus was responsible for, and he could have arranged the marriage either way. He was, after all, the king. The tradition does not record that he hesitated. When Hestia came to him with her oath, he accepted it, honored it, and gave her the first portion of every household sacrifice in return, which is another way of saying that he understood her correctly, that he recognized in her immunity not an inconvenience or a loss, but a proper ordering of the divine world, a placement of the right figure in the right position, a confirmation that the fire at the center of the house was most itself, when it was not also anyone's property. The first portion continued after that. It continued in every household, at every meal, in the rhythm of daily domestic life that is almost entirely undocumented because it was too ordinary to require documentation. Pindar refers to it. Multiple ancient sources confirm the practice. But the weight of the custom is not in the documentation. It is in the dailiness of it, in the fact that it happened on ordinary evenings in houses where no festival was occurring and no extraordinary ritual was required, where the family was simply eating and someone, before the meal, placed a portion at the hearth because that was what the fire received, because that was how the meal began, because the center of the house was acknowledged before the house gathered around it. The 13-line hymn is still there. The Greek text exists in the manuscripts, compact and luminous, having survived the same long passage through time that the larger hymns survived. The reader who comes to it expecting elaboration finds instead compression, 13 lines that name what needs to be named, and then stop, in the way that the fire does not elaborate on itself, in the way that the center of the room does not explain its own centrality. The hymn was written for a goddess whose essence, the tradition consistently suggests, did not accumulate. It did not build toward complexity. It did not require more mythology to be fully itself. She was the fire, and the fire was her name, and the name was the hearth, and the hearth was the center, and the center, having been named, required only tending. The compressed theology of those 13 lines is not poverty, it is precision. The hymn says that Hestia keeps Apollo's house at Delphi. It says that Hermes and Hestia may enter the house together with goodwill and prosperity. It offers a brief praise and a brief request, and then it ends, in the way that a thing ends when it has said what it came to say and has no interest in saying more. The goddess of the most minimal possible mythology, the goddess whose nature is to stay where she is, while everything that needs to be described moves around her. The hymn is the right length, the fire is the right size, the stone room is the right room, everything is in the right proportion for the thing it is. And a scholar reading the hymn in a lamplit room in the ancient world, holding the small scroll, or the wax tablet, or whatever form the text took in the particular time and place of that reading, would have encountered something that the hymn's brevity made vivid rather than diminished. 13 lines about a goddess who rejected two of the most powerful suitors in the divine assembly, swore the most binding oath available in the Greek tradition, and received as her reward the smallest and most repeated ritual in Greek domestic life. Nothing about this requires elaboration. The fire that burns every night, the portion placed before eating, the fire that is the goddess, and the goddess that is the fire, the name that is the word for hearth, and the word for hearth that is her name. Going back through the Greek language to a root older than the myths themselves, burning there, in the language, in the same way the fire burns in the stone room, without requiring explanation for any of it. The vow Hestia swore on Zeus's head was an act of enormous simplicity. It confirmed nothing new. It sealed what was already so. It asked the highest authority in the divine order to recognize formally that the center of the house was the center of the house, and that the fire burning at that center was not waiting to become something else. Whatever she had been inside Cronus for all those long years before Zeus forced the disgorging of his siblings, whatever she had been in the darkness before the myths had properly begun, she was that still. The same, the steadiness before Olympus had its name, the warmth before the divine family had gathered around it, the fire before the hearth was built, and still the fire after, and the fire in the hymn, and the fire on the page. 13 lines on a scroll. The text of the shorter hymn, in its standard form, compact as a flame, small enough to carry. A flame small enough to carry. The kind of flame that could survive a long journey if the vessel holding it was tended carefully, if the carrier understood that the fire needed only what fires need, air and fuel and the attention of someone who understood that carrying it was not the same as possessing it, that the fire traveled through the hands of whoever bore it without ever quite belonging to them, that it would arrive at the other end of the journey, the same fire it had been at the beginning, burning at the temperature it always burned at, ready to be set down on the new hearthstone and allowed to do what it had always done. The hearth in the stone room, the flame steady and low and amber-colored against the dark walls of the room, not performing stillness, not demonstrating calm, just burning, the way a fire burns when it has been the center of something for a long time and has no need to announce itself, and the room warm around it, on the hymn on the scroll somewhere, 13 lines of it, and the oldest sister somewhere in the tradition, sitting where she always sat, not having moved, the fire beside her, doing what fires do in the dark, going quietly about the business of being warm. In the Athenian agora, in a space open to the sky, and the noise of a city going about its ordinary business, there stood a low stone platform that the Athenians called the altar of the 12 gods. It was not tall. It was not the largest or most elaborate structure in the agora. The colonnades and the administrative buildings that surrounded the open square were more imposing by any architectural measure. The altar's significance was not in its scale, but in what it named, or rather in what it implied by naming, a group of gods whose collective divinity enclosed the Athenian understanding of the divine world, a set of 12 figures in whose hands the sky and sea and earth and the institutions of human civilization were held. The altar was established around 522 BCE, in the era of the Pisistrated tyrants, and it served also as the central point from which distances across Attica were formally measured, so that it stood at the literal and conceptual center of the city at once. A traveler setting out from Athens to any destination in the territory knew that the road began there, at the altar of the 12, at the stone that named the gods. The question of which 12 names that stone carried is a question that ancient sources do not answer with perfect consistency. The canon shifted. Different contexts produced different lists, and different sanctuaries accorded divine status with different priorities. What most sources agree on is something like this: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and then a final position that was occupied sometimes by Hestia and sometimes by Dionysus, as though the divine assembly had one seat that two gods shared by turning, one stepping forward as the other stepped quietly back. The tradition does not treat this arrangement as a conflict. It treats it as a resolution, and the manner of that resolution, who moved and how, and with what disposition, is, in the Greek tradition, entirely characteristic of one of the two figures involved. Hestia is the goddess who stepped back. The tradition holds that when Dionysus, born of the mortal woman Semele, daughter of Cadmus, and therefore not a god by lineage alone, had been accorded Olympian status by the divine assembly, it was Hestia who made room for him, not because she was required to, not because Zeus commanded it, or the other gods voted on it, or some mechanism of divine law necessitated the change. The mythological account as it comes down through later sources, including the 2nd century CE compiler Apollodorus in the Bibliotheca, and various references across Pindar and Pausanias, describes the act as Hestia's own, a yielding, a gesture of making space, a choice consistent with everything else the tradition records about who she was. She did not compete for the seat she had occupied. She did not mourn the giving of it. She stood, and she offered the chair to a god who had traveled further to reach the divine assembly than anyone currently seated in it, and then she returned to the hearth, which had never required a formal seat to remain the center of things. Dionysus was, in almost every respect, Hestia's opposite within the Olympian world. He was the god of wine and ecstasy and the dissolution of ordinary boundaries, the god under whose influence a person ceased to be only themselves and became, briefly, something larger and stranger, submerged in a collective experience that the Greeks associated with religious transformation and theatrical performance alike. His myths are full of motion, journeys across the known world and into the unknown, followers in procession, the vine growing and spreading and overrunning whatever it encounters. He was the god associated with the origin of tragedy in Athens, with the great public festivals at which thousands of citizens gathered in the open air to watch dramatic performances that were simultaneously civic and sacred, entertainment and worship, held in a theater that bore his name on the southern slope of the Acropolis. There is almost nothing about Dionysus that is still or interior or small. His domain was the crowd, the festival, the transformation that happens when many individual selves dissolve into something collective and overwhelming. Hestia's domain was the opposite of all of that. A single fire in a stone ring on the floor of a single room tended by one family, burning at the center of an interior space that no crowd would ever fill. The contrast between the two deities is precise enough that modern scholars of Greek religion have read the mythological tradition of the seat exchange as encoding something significant about Greek religious culture and the specific historical moment in which Dionysus's civic worship was consolidated and elaborated. Walter Burkert, whose scholarship on ancient Greek religion remains among the most carefully argued in the field, observed that the Hestia-Dionysus exchange reflects broader shifts in how Greek religious life was organized, a movement across the classical period from the older religion of the domestic interior toward the newer, more public, more ecstatic religion of the theater and the festival and the crowd. Hestia represented what the Greek household had always had: a fire, a family, a quiet acknowledgement of the divine in the daily acts of warmth and nourishment. Dionysus represented what the classical city had added: spectacle, communal transformation, the publicly organized emotional life of an entire civic population gathering together to feel something too large for any single house to contain. The exchange in this reading is not arbitrary. It follows the logic of what each deity was. A god of ecstasy and public theater needs a seat at the civic council of the divine because his domain is the public and the communal, the religion of the assembled crowd. A goddess of the hearth does not, in the same way, require a formal seat, because her presence is not located in any council chamber, but in every house simultaneously, in every fire that burns at the center of a domestic space, in every family that goes about the daily business of being warm and fed and home. The seat in the divine assembly is one kind of centrality. The hearth is another kind entirely. And the tradition seems to understand that Hestia already possessed the second kind, which meant she could afford to offer the first kind to someone who needed it more. What is perhaps most interesting in how the tradition handles this moment is the complete absence of diminishment. Hestia does not leave. She does not withdraw from Olympus in any permanent or aggrieved sense. She steps aside from one formal position while remaining entirely present in the religious life of Greece, unchanged and unchallenged in the specific domain that was hers. The custom of offering Hestia the first portion of every sacrifice, the first taste of food, the first pour of wine, the initial acknowledgement before any other god received their due, continued after the seat transfer exactly as it had before, attested in Pindar and confirmed across multiple other ancient sources. The household hearth continued to burn in her name. The Prytania of Greek city-states continued to maintain their sacred fires dedicated to her. The religious acknowledgement that marked her as foundational to domestic and civic life was not reduced or revised or reordered by the fact that a different god now held the 12th position at the divine assembly. In Greek religious practice, cult devotion and theological classification were not always the same thing, and the distance between them is exactly where Hestia's particular form of authority resided. Consider the altar of the 12 gods again, standing in the open agora under Athenian sky. The altar named a canon. Canons are formal structures. They have seats, positions, defined membership, the architecture of institutional recognition. But the religious life of the city did not happen only in the agora or only at the altar of canonical deities. It happened in every house in Athens, at every hearth, every morning when the first portion of the day's food was set aside and the household acknowledged what the fire at its center represented. The altar named 12 gods. Every hearthstone in Athens named one more, or perhaps not named, since the fire itself was the presence, and the fire's presence did not require a list. Dionysus arrived among the Olympians as a latecomer who had earned his place through a journey that was by any measure extraordinary. His mother Semele had been destroyed by the full revelation of Zeus's divine form before Dionysus was born, a mortal body unable to survive the unmediated presence of the divine. Zeus rescued the unborn child by sewing him into his own thigh, and Dionysus completed his gestation there, inside the body of a god, emerging fully divine from a mortal beginning. He descended to the underworld to retrieve his mother's shade and bring her to Olympus. He traveled to the farthest reaches of the known world and beyond, establishing his worship in territories as distant as India. He was opposed, imprisoned, maddened by adversaries who refused to recognize his divinity, and in the accounts that survive, from Euripides' Bacchae to Homeric hymns to scattered references across dozens of ancient texts, the story of Dionysus's recognition as a god is always also a story of how far he had to travel to be accepted as one. He came to the divine assembly having already done everything. The seat was a formality, an acknowledgement of what had been established through entirely other means, and Hestia gave it to him. In the characterization the Greek tradition had maintained for her across all its sources, from the Homeric hymns to the Theogony to the Homeric hymn to Aphrodite, this is exactly what Hestia would do. She is the deity who does not compete, does not seek erotic or political dominance, does not accumulate power in the ways that most of the Olympians accumulated. When Apollo and Poseidon sought to marry her, she declined them both and swore an oath to Zeus that she would remain as she was, not because marriage was offered as a trap or a reduction, but because she was already what she wanted to be, and the offer did not change that. The logic of the seat transfer belongs to the same pattern. She was already what she was. A seat at the divine council was one form of formal recognition. Her kind of centrality did not depend on formal recognition to remain central. She stood because a latecomer needed the chair, and standing cost her nothing that was actually hers. The Prytaneum, the civic building that housed the sacred hearth dedicated to Hestia, was a structure present in Greek city-states across the Aegean world. Archaeological evidence has recovered traces of Prytania at Athens, at Olympia, at Delphi, at Ephesus. The institution was not marginal or peripheral. It was the seat of the city's highest magistrates, the place where honored citizens were formally hosted, the building that housed the flame that the city treated as the civic equivalent of the household hearth, the fire at the center of the collective family that the polis represented. When important guests arrived in a Greek city, they were received at the Prytaneum. When the city sent out colonists to found a new settlement on a distant shore, the colonists carried fire from the Prytaneum with them, and the fire of the new city's Prytaneum was lit from that carried flame, so that the new settlement's sacred center was continuous with the mother city's sacred center through the physical medium of the same fire burning forward through space and time. These were not informal gestures. They were institutionalized expressions of what the Greek civic world understood about continuity and belonging, about what it meant for a community to be a community rather than simply a collection of people who happened to occupy the same territory. Hestia's absence from the formal Olympian canon when Dionysus held the 12th seat did not change any of this. The Prytania burned. The colonies carried their fires. The magistrates ate their meals at the hearth that bore her name. The tradition of offering her the first portion of every sacrifice was, if anything, more consistent and more universal than the attendance of most Olympians at their own cult sites. Every household in the Greek world that maintained a hearth and observed the standard domestic religious protocols was, whether they named it specifically or not, maintaining a relationship with Hestia. That relationship was not mediated by priests or temples in the way that the worship of Athena or Apollo was organized. It was conducted at the scale of the individual family, daily, through the simplest acts, the fire, the food, the first portion set aside before anyone ate. The intimacy of that arrangement was not a limitation, it was the whole point. There is something worth observing in how the ancient sources handle Dionysus's elevation and Hestia's withdrawal that is easy to miss if one reads for drama rather than for detail. The accounts are not elegiac. They do not describe a goddess who gave something up. They describe a canonical arrangement that shifted, and they describe Hestia's role in that shift in terms that are entirely consistent with her characterization everywhere else in the tradition. She accommodated without diminishment. She stepped aside without displacing herself. She made room without becoming smaller. The mythological tradition treats this as unremarkable in the specific sense that nothing about Hestia's nature is being violated or compromised. The act is simply what that nature looks like when it encounters a particular situation. She was not being magnanimous in some exceptional, celebrated way. She was being herself, which in the tradition's accounting is the same thing. The formal canon of the 12, as it was eventually standardized across Greek religious culture, most often included Dionysus and excluded Hestia from the counted 12. while continuing to treat her as entirely Olympian in character and authority. The altar of the 12 gods in the agora does not bear a specific list of names in the surviving archaeological record. What it bears is the designation of the group, and ancient authors who enumerate the 12 gods do so with variations that reflect regional and temporal differences in how the canon was understood. Some lists include Hestia and exclude Dionysus. Some include Dionysus and exclude Hestia. Some include Heracles in variant formulations. The canon was a living thing rather than a fixed one, and the debate over its precise membership across ancient sources is itself evidence of the way Greek religious life organized its understanding of the divine, not through a single authoritative text or institution, but through a conversation conducted across hundreds of years and dozens of city-states, in hymns and sculptures, and the names painted on the sides of sacred vessels, and the specific protocols followed at specific altars in specific places on specific days. Within that conversation, Hestia holds a position that is curiously resistant to formal enumeration. She appears in the lists when she appears, and she is absent from them when she is absent, but her absence from any particular list does not seem to have been understood as absence from the tradition. Pindar, writing in the early 5th century BCE, praises Hestia as first among the gods in the context of the first portion of sacrifice. The Homeric hymns include 2 hymns dedicated specifically to her, one brief enough to be spoken in a single breath, the other naming her, alongside Hermes, as a companion welcomed into every house. These are not the texts of a goddess who had been set aside or diminished. They are the texts of a goddess whose particular form of presence did not require the formal architecture of canonical inclusion to remain fully present. Dionysus, for his part, needed the seat in a way that Hestia did not, and this asymmetry is part of what the myth seems to be acknowledging. A god whose domain is the public festival, the gathered crowd, the civic theater, the ecstatic dissolution of individual selfhood into collective experience, is a god who operates in the realm where canonical status is most visible and most meaningful. Dionysus's worship was public in the fullest sense, organized by the state, funded by civic institutions, performed before thousands of people at designated times in designated places. The theater of Dionysus on the southern slope of the Acropolis in Athens seated approximately 17,000 people. The Dionysia, the great festival that included the performance of tragedies and comedies, was a civic and religious event of such magnitude that legal proceedings were suspended during its celebration. Prisoners were sometimes released to attend, and foreign delegations who happened to be in Athens were formally admitted to witness it. This was religion at the scale of the entire city, making itself visible to itself, using dramatic performance as the vehicle. A god associated with all of this had, in a particular way, need of a seat among the 12 recognized gods of the Athenian civic altar, because his domain was precisely the domain in which the altar and the canon and the formal civic recognition of the gods operated. Hestia's domain was the interior of a single room. That is not a diminishment of her domain. It is an accurate description of where her presence was most fully itself, and the Greek tradition seems to have understood this distinction clearly enough to hold both realities simultaneously without contradiction. Hestia was among the most universally present of the gods, in the sense that every household fire in every part of the Greek world was a form of her presence, while also being among the least publicly visible, in the sense that her worship did not require any civic structure, any organized festival, any formal gathering of people in any designated place. She was everywhere that a family was warm, and she was nowhere that required a crowd. The mythological tradition that records the seat transfer is therefore not a story about one god defeating or displacing another, not a story about institutional politics or divine hierarchy resolved through conflict. It is a story that reads, in its deepest logic, like a description of something that had already happened in the religious culture of Greece before anyone needed to narrate it. A story that explains how a goddess, whose domain was the private and interior, gradually found herself standing outside a formal canon that was increasingly organized around public, civic, spectacular forms of worship, not because she was pushed out, but because she had, in some essential way, already been elsewhere. The hearth does not need a seat at the divine council to remain the center of the house. It needs a fire. When scholars like Burkert observe the Hestia-Dionysus exchange as encoding a historical shift in Greek religious culture, they are pointing to something that is legible in the archaeology and the texts across the classical period, the elaboration of public, civic, collectively organized worship alongside and gradually overtaking the quieter, more interior, more domestic forms of religious practice. Temples grew larger and more numerous. State festivals became more elaborate. The organization of worship by civic institutions became more systematized and comprehensive. Alongside all of this expansion of the public religious world, the quiet domestic fire at the household hearth continued to burn. But the cultural attention, the theological investment, the literary and artistic elaboration of the tradition moved increasingly toward the gods, whose domains matched the scale and character of the classical city. Hestia did not move with it. She remained where she had always been, at the scale she had always occupied, doing what she had always done. There is a feast table somewhere in the classical world, not a specific one, but a representative one that stands for every table at which a Greek family prepared to eat, at which the first portion of food is set aside before anyone touches the rest. The gesture is quiet. It does not require a priest or a prayer of any particular formality. It requires only that someone remember to do it first, to acknowledge that the fire which made the meal possible is itself owed the first portion of what it helped produce, and that the goddess whose name and whose nature the fire carries is in this domestic act being honored. Children born into Greek households would have seen this gesture performed every day of their lives, would have learned it not as an instruction, but as a simple fact of how meals begin, the way they learned that the fire needed to be tended and the hearthstone kept clear. Hestia's presence in those households was not marked by any image or statue. She was, distinctively among the Olympians, rarely depicted in anthropomorphic form in early Greek art, because the tradition understood her presence as the fire itself rather than as a person who could be portrayed beside it. She was the hearth. The hearth was her. The distinction between the goddess and her domain was, in the domestic context, largely irrelevant. That the first portion continued to be offered to her after the sea transfer, continued to be offered regardless of which list a given source placed her on or excluded her from, continued to be the opening gesture of household religious observance across the Greek world and then across the Roman world, as her counterpart Vesta is itself the most complete refutation of any reading of the seed exchange as loss, a goddess who receives the first portion of every meal in every household in the Greek-speaking world is not a goddess who has been diminished by the formal arrangements of a divine council. She is a goddess whose domain turned out to be so foundational that the formal arrangements of the divine council simply did not reach it. Dionysus arrived in the assembly. Hestia stood. She offered the chair to the latecomer who needed it. to the god whose entire mythological biography was a story of traveling enormous distances to be recognized and accepted as divine. And then she returned to the hearth, which was where she had always been, which was where her presence was most fully itself, which was where every family in the Greek world acknowledged her every morning when they lit the fire, and every evening when they set the first portion aside before they ate. The divine council noted a change in its formal membership. The households of Greece noticed nothing different at all. The altar in the Athenian agora stood in an open square where the noise of the city, merchants, magistrates, people crossing from one part of the city to another, the particular civic hum of a democratic city in full activity, moved around it at a comfortable distance. The altar was a civic monument. It named the gods at the center of the city's self-understanding. It served as the origin point for the measurement of the city's roads and its reach into the surrounding territory. The 12 names it implied were the 12 through whom the Athenians understood the divine world to be organized and the divine powers to be distributed. And somewhere below the altar, in the streets that ran away from the agora into the residential quarters of the city, in the houses that lined those streets, in the rooms at the center of those houses, there were fires burning, small fires, fires tended by families rather than by priests, fires that received the first portion of the household's food each morning before the family ate, that burned at the center of every significant domestic event, the birth of a child, the welcome of a guest, the departure of a traveler, that had burned in those houses before the altar existed, and would burn in them long after the question of whether the 12th seat belonged to Hestia or Dionysus had settled into something that no one needed to debate. The tradition holds that Hestia stepped aside willingly, without drama, without grief, without any diminishment of the authority that had always been hers. That is consistent with everything else the tradition records about her. She was the firstborn child of Cronus and Rhea, the eldest of the 6 siblings who would become the Olympian gods, the first swallowed and the last released, and through all of that, the tradition does not describe her as damaged or diminished by the experience. She simply was what she was, continuously and without interruption, through circumstances that would have transformed most of the other Olympians into something different. She swore her oath of virginity to Zeus and returned to the hearth. She declined Apollo and Poseidon and returned to the hearth. She yielded the formal seat at the divine council to Dionysus and returned to the hearth. The hearth is where the pattern ends every time, and the hearth continued to burn. On an ordinary evening, in an ordinary house, in an ordinary Greek city, on a night with no festival, no ritual of exceptional significance, no civic event or religious ceremony that required anyone to gather anywhere, a family was preparing to eat. The food had been cooked, the table had been set. Before anyone sat down, before the first plate was touched, someone moved to the hearth. They set aside a small portion, a first portion, the first portion, as the custom required, and they placed it at the fire. The fire received it, as it always had. The family sat. The meal began. No one named Dionysus in that gesture. No one named the 12 gods of the agora altar, or thought about which 12 they were. They named, or simply acknowledged in the habitual motion of placing something at the fire. The goddess whose name was the same word as the hearthstone itself, the same word as the fire, the same word as the warmth that filled the room around them. Hestia. The first portion still, and the small fire receiving it, still, and the warmth moving out from the center of the room into every corner of the house, low and amber-colored and steady, exactly as it had always been. Someone's arms are moving in a slow circle. The hearthstone is at the center of the motion, and the fire is low and amber and steady, and the arms belong to a family member who has been awake since before first light, and what they are carrying, held close against the chest, wrapped in cloth, bushed small enough that the whole weight of the thing rests in the crook of one elbow, is a child who is 7 days old. The circle is not wide. It takes only a few steps to complete. The person walking it moves without hurry, feet finding the worn stone floor in the particular quiet of a house that has not yet fully woken, and the fire at the center of the circle catches the motion and holds it, the light on the walls moving gently as the person moves, the shadows shifting and returning, the whole room breathing in a slow and measured rhythm that has nothing to do with urgency and everything to do with welcome. This was the amphidromia. The word comes from the Greek for running around, though the pace of it was never a run, and perhaps never was. It was performed on the 5th or 7th day after a child was born, in households across the ancient Greek world, and its purpose was precise, to carry the newborn in a circle around the hearth, introducing the child to the fire, incorporating them formally into the family's religious community, making them known to the goddess whose presence the flame held. Aristophanes refers to it. The lexicon of Hesychius preserves its name. It was not an unusual or ceremonial occasion, but a domestic one, the kind of act that a household performed because households had always performed it, the kind of ritual whose meaning was so woven into the fabric of daily life that it needed no explanation on the morning it happened. The child would not remember it. The fire would not change. And yet the act was understood to matter, to bind the new life to the hearthstone, to the warmth, to the goddess who had been associated with that warmth since before the oldest myths had names. What the amphidromia describes in its quiet motion is a relationship between a fire and a life that begins at the very beginning of the life, not at a temple, not at a festival or a public rite. At the hearth of the house, on an ordinary morning, in the specific warmth of a room where bread had been baked, and hands had been warmed, and guests had been welcomed, and the family's prayers had been said in the low, unhurried way that private prayer sounds when no one outside the household is listening. The goddess was already there. The ritual simply made the introduction, that quality of presence without announcement, of being already there, already burning, already at the center of whatever the household was doing, is perhaps what most distinctly characterizes the tradition around Hestia. She did not arrive with trumpets or sea change, or the particular electric disturbance that the older stories associated with gods whose domains involved power and contest, and the management of the world's weather. She was simply present. The fire was lit, and she was in it. The fire was tended, and she was being tended. The family gathered around the hearth, and Hestia was the thing they gathered around. The Prytanean of Athens extended this same logic into civic life. The building stood near the Acropolis, in the northeastern quarter of the ancient city, and it housed a sacred fire of Hestia that burned continuously, not as a monument or a spectacle, but as the city's own version of the household hearth, scaled up to accommodate the city's own version of a household. The Prytaneas were the executive council of Athens in its democratic period, the rotating body of magistrates responsible for the city's day-to-day governance, and they were required during their term of service to eat their meals in the Prytaneon at a table near the fire. Thucydides mentions the building. Athenaeus records what was served there. The fire that Hestia occupied was not separate from the civic function, it was continuous with it. The meal was a religious act, not because any ceremony was performed during it, but because the act of eating in that building, near that fire, made it one. The goddess's presence was the ceremony. There was something in the arrangement that the Greeks appear to have found entirely natural. The idea that the most ordinary act, repeated in the most ordinary way, in the presence of the hearth, was also a sacred one, not elevated, not transformed into something other than what it was, simply recognized as already being, in its dailiness and its warmth and its sustaining repetition, something worth acknowledging. The Prytanes ate their evening meal. The fire held its position at the room's center. The city went on doing what cities do, the argument and the market and the public business of thousands of people trying to live together in a small space. And the hearth burned at the center of it, in a room that smelled of food and stone and old wood, the same way it had burned the night before and would burn the night after, its continuity the whole point. The practice of carrying fire from one place to another, of treating flame as something that could be transported without losing what it was, belongs to the same logic. When a Greek colony was founded on a foreign shore, the colonists carried fire from the hearth of their mother city, and that fire, landing in new ground, made the new settlement a legitimate extension of the old one. It was not a copy of the fire. It was the fire, or at least the tradition held it to be, and that holding was what made the colony something other than a group of people camping in an unfamiliar place. It gave the settlement a hearth, and Hestia, and therefore a home. The version of this that entered the modern world came to Olympia first. The site at Olympia had maintained a sacred flame for centuries, and it was here, according to the practice introduced at the 1936 Games, the practice that has continued in the sequence of Olympic years since, that the modern torch relay begins. A parabolic mirror is set up in the ruins of the ancient sanctuary. On the morning chosen for the ceremony, the mirror is angled toward the sun, and the focused light descends to a point, and at that point dry tinder is placed, and the sunlight gathered, concentrated, brought to a single concentrated purpose, produces a flame. The flame then travels. It is passed from hand to hand, carried by relay runners across roads and borders and open water, held in a torch that is passed before the torch goes out, the fire itself continuous even as the hands holding it change. The ceremony that introduced this practice described it explicitly in terms of the ancient Greek tradition, fire carried from a civic hearth to a new location, the new location made meaningful by what the fire carried with it. The symbolism was borrowed consciously. What the ceremony did not need to borrow, because it was simply repeating the logic, was the understanding that fire in motion is still fire, that continuity of flame is a kind of continuity of presence, that what arrives at the stadium after a journey of hundreds of miles is still, in the terms the practice establishes for itself, the same light that began at Olympia with the angle of the sun through a curved mirror and the patience of a morning in Greece. The Vestal Virgins of Rome maintained the same logic in the Forum for longer than most institutions in the ancient world maintained anything. The College of Six Priestesses, their title derived from Vesta, who derived from the same ancient root as Hestia, the same Proto-Indo-European syllable meaning burn or dwell, was charged with keeping the eternal flame of Rome alive. The flame burned in the circular temple of Vesta, near the center of the Forum, and its continuity was Rome's continuity, in the understanding that the institution embodied. The priestesses served for a minimum of 30 years. They entered the college as children, chosen from patrician families, and they remained within its structure through their childhood and their adult lives, maintaining the fire, performing the rites, occupying a position that Roman civic life held in a regard that was both religious and practical. They were legally emancipated from paternal authority in an era when such authority was extensive and rarely relinquished. They had the right to own property. They could intervene by their presence at an execution to stay a death sentence. The institution persisted from the legendary reign of King Numa, the old quiet king who was credited with organizing Rome's religious life into the forms it would hold for centuries, through the reign of Theodosius I, who ended it in 394 CE as part of the consolidation of Christian imperial authority. The flame that had burned in the Temple of Vesta for that span of time was not lit again in the same way after Theodosius closed the temple. The tradition does not hold that it was, the record does not make that claim, and the honest account simply notes the closure and moves on. What it does note, in the continuation of things, is that the logic of the flame did not close with the institution that had held it. It went elsewhere. It became a different thing. But the pattern, the small fire, the dedicated attendant, the continuity understood as sacred, the flame that must not go out, reappears in forms that owe something to what the Vestals embodied, even when those forms do not name Vesta or Hestia directly. The eternal flame in a church, the lamp that burns before an altar through the night, the Olympic torch passed from hand to hand across a continent. The logic is the same logic, expressed in different vocabularies, by different traditions, in different centuries. The fire that must continue is the fire that matters. The fire that is tended is the fire that is sanctified. What made the Vestal College remarkable within its own context was not its religious function alone, but the specificity and duration of its commitment. 30 years. Not an annual appointment, not a seasonal rite. 30 years of morning attendance at the fire, of keeping watch through the night when the watch fell to you, of being responsible, personally, bodily, as a matter of your own life and standing, for the continuity of a flame that the city understood as its own life and standing. The weight of that responsibility was matched by the privileges it carried, but the privileges were given because the responsibility was understood to be real. The priestess who let the fire go out could be punished. The fire was not a symbol permitted to gutter. It was a fire, and it had to burn, and the woman whose charge it was knew that the way a person knows something that is simply true about the shape of their daily life. Hestia herself, in the Greek tradition, held a similar relationship to an ongoing responsibility that had no endpoint built into it. The first portion of every sacrifice made in every house, the first and last libation at every meal, not a feast day offering, every sacrifice, every meal. The ritual acknowledgement was as continuous as the fire itself, and what the continuity preserved was not Hestia's power. She was not a goddess who accumulated power through worship in the way that some Olympian traditions described, but her presence. She was there because she was acknowledged. She was acknowledged because she was there. The circularity was the point. John Shinoda Bolen, writing in the early 1980s as a psychiatrist and Jungian analyst, found in that circularity a psychological structure worth naming. Her 1984 book, Goddesses in Every Woman, brought the classical figure of Hestia into contact with Jungian archetypal theory, and the result was a characterization of what Bolen called the Hestia archetype, the person who finds meaning, not through achievement or relationship or engagement with the world's contests, but through the quality of attention brought to ordinary life. The Hestia type in Bolen's framework is the inwardly focused person for whom the sacred is not a category separate from the everyday, but identical with it, present in the preparation of food, in the tending of a space, in the sustained and patient attention that transforms a habitual act into something recognized as worth doing. The book was widely read. It introduced Hestia to a large modern audience that had no particular background in classical scholarship and found in the archetypal framework a way of describing a kind of person, a kind of life that existing vocabularies did not adequately name. The framework was Jungian, not classical, and Bolin was careful to use it as a lens rather than a claim about the Greek tradition's own intentions. But the connection she drew held something true about Hestia, as the ancient sources described her: a goddess whose domain was the interior, the ordinary, the unspectacular, whose authority came not from force or brilliance or the management of great events, but from a quality of settled, consistent, warmly undramatic presence. The goddess who asked for the first portion of every household sacrifice was not asking for the largest or most impressive portion. She was asking to be acknowledged before anything else happened, before the meal began, before the family dispersed to their various concerns, before the day moved on from this moment of gathered warmth into whatever came next. The acknowledgement was small, the gesture was habitual, and in the habitual smallness of it, the tradition held was the thing that kept the hearth burning and the household together and the city connected to its own center, wherever that center lived. There is something in this that does not resolve neatly into any single description. The modern inheritors of Hestia's logic appear in places that would not name themselves her inheritors, in the attention a person brings to making a meal for someone they love, in the care taken with the arrangement of a room, in the act of returning to a practice, not because the practice is dramatic, but because the returning itself is the point. The Amphidromia circle, the Prytanean meal, the Vestal watch, the Olympic torch passed at the moment before it would go out. These are all versions of the same motion, the tending of something that must not be left alone. The ancient Greek domestic hearth itself was a specific and unspectacular object. It was not always the elaborate stone structure that large houses might contain. In smaller homes, it could be a simple clay ring set on the earthen floor, a depression in a flagstone, a raised circle of baked earth at the room's center, designed to contain a fire safely and to radiate its heat outward into the surrounding space. The fire it held was not decorative. It cooked the food, it warmed the room, it was the light in the hour before dawn, when the household woke, and the light in the late evening when the household returned to rest. Its religious significance and its practical significance were not separable, because the tradition never separated them. The goddess and the function were the same word: Hestia, the hearth, Hestia, the goddess, and speaking one was speaking both, quietly and without ceremony, every time the word was said. The persistence of Hestia's worship across the full span of classical antiquity did not depend on festivals or dramatic mythological narratives or the kind of compelling divine biography that made other Olympians the subject of epic poetry and theatrical performance. She appears in the Homeric hymns in a few brief luminous lines. She is named in Plato. She is present in Pindar's references to the first portion custom. The tradition consistently awards her the first sacrifice and the last, and then tends to say relatively little else, as though the acknowledgement itself were sufficient, and the elaboration would somehow miss the point. The Homeric hymn to Hestia, the shorter of the two dedicated to her, runs to 13 lines in its standard Greek text. 13 lines for a goddess who governed the hearth of every household and the civic hearth of every city. The compression was not an oversight. The hymn describes her as the keeper of the sacred dwelling of Apollo at Delphi, the god of light and prophecy inhabiting the most famous oracular sanctuary in the Greek world, and at the center of that sanctuary, at its still burning center, Hestia. The hymn ends by asking that she enter the house alongside Hermes, the god of motion and exchange and the crossing of thresholds, with goodwill and beauty and prosperity. The pairing is characteristic, the god who moves and the goddess who stays, both invited in together, both necessary, neither quite completing the home's hospitality without the other. The logic of the pairing held something the tradition understood about the nature of a household, and perhaps about the nature of any gathered community, that what is fixed and what is in motion are not opposites but complements. The hearth stays, the travelers arrive and depart. The hearth stays while they do both. It is still burning when the journey is over and the travelers return, and the return is possible partly because the thing that makes the house a home has not moved in the interval. The Roman continuation of this logic in Vesta's temple and the Vestal College extended the domestic hearth into civic permanence in a way that Athens had also attempted with the Prytaneum, but that Rome elaborated with a particular institutional solidity. The flame in the forum did not represent Rome's continuity. It was understood to be Rome's continuity, in the sense that if it went out, something essential about the city's relationship to its own ongoing life was understood to have been interrupted. The priestess who let it go out was punished not as a negligent employee, but as someone who had allowed a sacred continuity to break. The flame was tended accordingly, with the attention appropriate to something that must not be permitted to fail. What the Vestal College preserved, through its long centuries of operation, was not simply the physical flame, but the practice of attention itself, the daily check, the nightly watch, the morning tending, the small, repeated, undramatic act of making sure the fire was still burning and adding what it needed to continue. This is not a practice that rewards the practitioner with dramatic experience. It rewards them with the knowledge that the thing they are responsible for is still there, still burning, still doing what a fire does, which is to give light and warmth and the possibility of the next meal, steadily, without requiring acknowledgement of its own. On an ordinary evening in Athens, in the century that produced the architecture the Acropolis still holds, the family gathered around the household hearth, as families do. The fire had been burning all day. The evening meal was prepared at its edge. The first portion was set aside before anyone ate, placed in the fire or near it, acknowledged without ceremony, the way that things acknowledged every day require no ceremony to make them real. The youngest child in the household had been carried around this same hearthstone a few years before, in a slow circle, in someone's arms, in the early morning quiet of the seventh day. The child now sat near the fire, the way that children sit near fires, close enough for warmth, absorbed in whatever absorbs a child at the end of a long day, not thinking about the goddess in the flame, or the origin of the practice, or the Prytaneum on the other side of the city, where the same fire burned in a larger room. The child was simply warm. The fire was simply burning. The evening was moving at the pace that evenings move when nothing unusual is happening, which is to say, slowly and towards sleep, and with the particular quality of an ordinary ending that has no drama in it and needs none. What Hestia governed was exactly this, not the great moments, not the arrival of heroes, or the departure of armies, or the adjudication of divine disputes, the ordinary evening, the warm room, the meal prepared and shared and finished, the fire that had been burning when the day began and would be burning when the day ended, giving its warmth to everyone in the room with an equal and undiscriminating generosity that asked nothing back except the small acknowledgement, the first portion, the first word of the prayer The simple recognition that the fire was there and the fire mattered. The fact that this recognition extended, without interruption, from the earliest Greek households through the Vestal College's last morning watch, through the parabolic mirror at Olympia, and the torch carried by relay runners across the modern world, through the archetypal framework of a 20th century analyst writing about the kinds of lives that institutions tend to overlook. The fact that the logic persisted, changed its clothes and its vocabulary and its institutional home, and yet remained recognizably the same logic, is not a dramatic discovery. It is simply what happens with things that are genuinely central. They continue, they find new forms. The form changes and the center remains, the way that a fire changes its shape constantly and remains fire throughout. A hearthstone in a stone-floored room, the fire low in the late evening, the way fires go when the household has stopped adding to them, not going out, not diminished, but settled into the particular amber steadiness of a fire that has been burning for hours and has found its own sustained tempo. The room is cooler now at the edges, nearer the walls, but here, near the stone ring that holds the fire, the air is warm. The warmth radiates in all directions with the unhurried evenness that warmth has when there is no draft and no urgency, and nothing requiring the fire to be anything other than what it is. The room is quiet. Someone has gone to sleep already. Someone else is still moving in another part of the house, the sound of their movement arriving at low volume, footsteps, and the soft percussion of a household settling. The fire does not respond to any of this. It continues at its own pace, on its own terms, its light moving across the walls in the slow, rhythmic way that firelight moves, when nothing disturbs it, advancing slightly, retreating, never quite repeating the same pattern twice, and yet always recognizable as fire pattern, as the particular kind of light that only a live flame produces. This is what Hestia held. This specific quality of warmth in a specific kind of room at a specific hour when the day has finished and the night has not yet deepened into its full dark. Not an abstract warmth, not warmth as symbol or warmth as theological category. The actual sensation of being near a low fire on a stone floor in a room where people sleep and eat and are born and grow old, in the proximity of a flame that has been burning all day and will be burning when the morning comes. The first portion is already given